Thank you for joining me in what will likely be the final video format update here on the winter storm that's expected into especially our February 12th and 13th, as well as the very early part of the 14th across a lot of the United States. If you enjoyed this update, subscribe down below, but let's go ahead and start here with this overview using the custom graphic I have on screen, as a big winter storm is expected to bring snow to areas including parts of the Central Plains, stretching into the Midwest in places like Iowa, northern Missouri, northern Illinois, and then into southern Wisconsin, parts of Indiana, and then especially on up into Michigan could also see snow or ice out of this system, and then snow will turn over to ice and then to rain in a lot of zones into parts of the northeast U.S. with this very messy system. The storm also having the potential to bring severe weather and flooding with a big area of rain and storms. Even if you don't see severe weather, you could be looking at a flood threat into parts of the south, especially from Texas all the way up to the Ohio Valley and then back down towards the Carolinas, points in between. Looking like a very active setup as we go through the next 48 hours. And I want to start by breaking down the snow aspect, then we'll break down the severe weather and flooding aspect as we get towards the second half of the video. So use the timestamps in the description to skip ahead to the specific part that you would like to see. All right, here we are looking at some of the latest guidance from today with our HRRR model, looking for any shifts and changes since my last video as we track things out with winter weather, and it looks like things are going to begin to pick up as we get into the overnight here of our Tuesday night, pushing into the early part of our Wednesday morning, where snow could begin to break out into parts of southern Nebraska as well as northern and central Kansas. Most of this generally light to moderate, at least as we get into the pre-dawn hours of our Wednesday. Down on the south side of that snow, however, we're going to be watching what could be the most concerning thing going on by this point in time, ice picking up as we get towards this point, and then even closer to sunrise in northern Oklahoma, pushing through places like Oklahoma City up to Tulsa, and then eventually here into the Ozarks region of Arkansas, pushing into Missouri. Speaking of Missouri, the northern part of that state into the northwestern zones, looking like this is going to be an all-snow event there, including places like Kansas City, into parts of east central Kansas, into parts of Kansas City, Missouri, northern parts of Missouri, and then into southern Iowa. That's where it looks like we're going to have the best chance for more of this light to moderate snow, maybe even briefly heavy snow at times pushing through as we get towards around that morning rush and sunrise time frame. So if you do have to travel in this, make sure you're taking it a little bit slower on those roadways, as things could definitely become dicey, even though this isn't necessarily the heaviest winter storm you could have in some of these areas. As we get beyond the early morning time frame, push through mid-morning, and then get closer to lunchtime, that's when things become a little bit more interesting in terms of some of our snow totals that we're going to pick up as we get out of parts of the Central Plains and into the Midwest. It looks like a lot of our snow that's going to move into parts of eastern Iowa and then eventually into Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan is going to be broken up into some bands that could be more on that light to moderate side as opposed to moderate to heavy. And that's definitely going to turn your totals down a little bit in comparison to what I was thinking and what a lot of guidance was thinking yesterday. Things have turned it down. We're still looking at 3 to 6 inches plus in a lot of zones here, but it's not necessarily going to be a half foot or more in a lot of these zones that get snow. And the same is going to go down there in some areas that flirt with ice, like St. Louis, Missouri, and then on up here into parts of central Illinois and Indiana, wherever that ice line sets up. Of course, a little bit less in the way of snow there. Nonetheless, this winter weather side of our storm continues. And again, we're still going to be seeing a good bit of snow from Bloomington up to Ottawa to Chicago there in Illinois, looking like we're going to get some decent snow at some point as we go through the afternoon and evening, even if it's on and off. Same goes up to Madison and Milwaukee there in Wisconsin, and a lot of northern Indiana into southern Michigan. This could be a hot spot now with some of the latest model trends if this continues to look like this, where we get some heavier snow. Detroit, Michigan, it's going to be a little bit of a closer line between snow and ice. Same goes down to Toledo there in Ohio, and then back down towards Bellefontaine. At the same time that all of this winter weather is going on in the Great Lakes, though, that's when we're going to begin to see winter weather kicking off with ice in the higher terrain of the central Appalachians, a little bit of a tail of snow moving through some parts of the Northeast. Let's go ahead and zoom things out so that you can see the big picture of this as we get through the evening hours, or at least what's being simulated by the time we get towards 7, 8, 9, 10 in the evening of our Wednesday. Still snowing, and again, some of this could be moderate to maybe even briefly heavy into parts of Michigan and northern Indiana. Detroit might even switch over to snow as we get towards the backside of this storm through the night. And then over here into the northeast, look at this. We've got some snow in patchy areas there into the interior zones by this point in time, maybe even stretching a little bit closer to the coast than this guidance indicates. Some ice behind that, and then transitioning over to rain through parts of Pennsylvania, New York, and then eventually that ice line is going to transition north into any areas that see snowfall, so that by the time we get towards 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, transitioning from any snow that we might see to start this out, Going over to ice in a place like Boston, over to Springfield there in Massachusetts, sure, we might briefly see some of this heavy snow through Montpelier, Vermont, over to Plattsburgh, New York, and then back down through parts of Concord in New Hampshire and Portland, Maine. But look at the transition that's going to quickly happen with this winter weather as we get through the morning hours of Thursday. That quick line is going to continue to move north, and this is the furthest this particular run that I'm using is going to go, but we're just going to continue to see with this warm front, this ice push north and disrupt those snow totals, really keeping the heaviest ones that will go uninterrupted only into parts of north central Maine. Even northern New York is going to get a lot of ice out of this particular event as opposed to snow, and maybe even a brief transition to rain at the end of the event. In terms of the total forecasted snowfall and ice, we're going to go region by region using this national blend of models. I think this does the best job of showing some of these downgraded totals that have now been projected here by some of our models. It's not a huge downgrade, but many zones are going to get closer to 3 to 6 as opposed to 6 to 10 inches of snow, and I'm going to go ahead and break that down for you here region by region. First of all, if you live in about the southern 2/3 of Nebraska, especially as you get down closer to that Kansas border, most spots in these blues picking up upwards of 3 to 6 inches of snow. I think a few spots, again, especially closer to Kansas, could exceed 6 inches and get closer to 7 or 8. That could be in places like Omaha and Lincoln, and the same will go here through about the northern half of Kansas, 3 to 6 inches for most spots, but as you get closer to the Nebraska border, about 7, 8, or 9 inches of snow could be possible in some of those heavier bands if this forecast holds. Missouri and Illinois, if you get north of this line, which basically runs right through the central half of the states, if you get north of there, most spots picking up upwards of 3 inches of snow, and it will be closer to around 6 inches or some locally higher amounts as you get towards the borders with Iowa and then Wisconsin, depending on if you're in Missouri or Illinois. Speaking of Iowa and Wisconsin, most of Iowa and the southern half of Wisconsin at least picking up those blues, indicating 3 to 6 inches, but some locally higher spots could get closer to, again, 6 or 8. In terms of freezing rain accretion on those surfaces, those power lines, those trees in a lot of these areas, I think most of the problems are going to come from slick spots on roadways from this glaze to 1/10 of an inch that we're going to pick up from central and northern Oklahoma through that zone of central Missouri and central Illinois, where we're going to be in that transition zone. Power outages should not be a problem, but we could see at least some isolated issues, so be on the lookout for that. Then we shift on up here into parts of the Great Lakes with your forecast snowfall, where it looks like as you come out of northern Indiana and then into some parts of Michigan, we're going to rack up on some of those possible accumulations. You could see about 2 to 4 inches plus. I think it could get a little bit higher than this into about the northern third of Indiana, not including places like Indianapolis, but points north from there. Then as you get on up here into Michigan, many spots looking at upwards of 4 to 6, and I think Michigan's going to be the best chance area for more widespread 6 to 8 inches into the eastern part of the state as accumulations pick up out of there and into Canada. Then here we go in terms of the ice for this region as you come out of parts of central Illinois and then stretch up into Indiana, Ohio, and parts of Michigan. We could definitely see some significant ice. You can see this zone and then eventually stretching over into Pennsylvania and New York. A lot more spots getting more than a glaze to 1/10 of an inch, some spots closer to a 1/10 to a 1/4 of an inch of ice, and that's where you start to see even some isolated power outages becoming a factor, and roadway travel is a lot more dangerous. So as we get towards Wednesday evening and the impacts pick up in these zones, you want to make sure you're taking it slow on the roadways or just avoiding them in general. Last but not least, your 12-hour increments of snowfall as you get on up here into the northeast. Notice the blend of guidance indicating that we could briefly pick up a couple of inches of snow in a place like northern Massachusetts or into Vermont or New Hampshire, but again, it's going to quickly move through and get forced north into places like Maine as a result of that rainfall that's going to move in and that freezing rain. Up here in the far northern parts of Maine, this is where your 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6 inches of snow that you get could actually have a better chance of staying on the ground and not being suppressed, because we're going to get less in the way of freezing rain and sleet up into those zones. Again, though, freezing rain is going to be a lot more of a problem over a lot of areas, and as you can see here, a lot of spots averaging out to get about a glaze to 1/10 of an inch of ice here, quickly turning over to rain in a lot of these zones, but wherever we get some of these slick spots to form through Wednesday evening into early Thursday across the majority of the Northeast from south to north, it's mainly going to be those bridges and overpasses, though, that become the problem. Bridges ice before a road. They don't make that sign for nothing. Make sure you're being careful out there on the roadways or just avoiding travel into that time frame. Now that we've discussed the winter weather, I want to break down severe weather and flooding, and that starts here with an overview of that severe weather risk we're going to see into Wednesday and Wednesday night with my custom ONW severe scale highlighting it down here over parts of the deep south, lower Mississippi Valley, and the southeast. Wednesday and Wednesday night is going to be that main time frame, not really tonight, not really into Thursday, but really during this time frame when we're as high as a level 3 of 7 on my scale coming out of especially Louisiana into Mississippi, Alabama, with a level 2 of 7 even extending over into Georgia, and some general thunderstorms that could be around that as indicated by the level 1 risk as far north as Tennessee and the western Carolinas. This generally means in those darker greens moving into the yellows that we have enough instability and changing of wind direction with height into the atmosphere to support some storms that could produce not only damaging winds but even some tornadoes. And I want to go ahead and time out the rainfall and the severe weather and all of that right here with this latest guidance from the HRRR model. Alright, here we are jumping into some of that timing, which begins this evening with the most recent winter system that I've broken down in previous videos, leaving a mess with rain and flooding risks already rising with all these storms going on from Tennessee back down to Louisiana and Texas as we go through tonight. As you can see, as we get into the overnight, you can start to see some of our energy filling up more of these zones where a line of storms that moves through parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and over into Alabama as we go through the morning into the early afternoon. Any storms in this general zone here could not only produce flooding, but we could also be watching the risk for some severe weather already elevating as early as the mid-morning time frame and into the early afternoon, with mainly damaging winds being a threat, but maybe some isolated tornadoes and some of the storms that can remain a little bit more on their own, isolated, or what's better known as discrete supercells in the meteorology world. We'll be keeping an eye on all of that kind of weather as we go through the morning, while we also just watch flooding becoming a threat over a lot more zones. I want to point out the fact that even in parts of northern Arkansas, southern Missouri, heavy rain could be a threat. Same goes up into some parts of the Ohio Valley, as a lot of this just fills up parts of the central and eastern U.S. as we go through our Wednesday afternoon. But back down to that severe weather threat, again, there's that line that could become a little bit more consolidated and be a problem into the early to mid-afternoon time frame out of Mississippi into Alabama. We'll certainly have to watch those storms, so be on alert with that round into the middle of the day. And then as we get later into the day, new storms could fire up back down here into parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and then eventually trend back to the north. You can see how this could also be a flooding problem as we see storm after storm training over a lot of the same areas. But that could also be a 1-2 punch for severe weather as we get more of this moisture lifting north and feeding these storms again, as they're a little bit more isolated as opposed to messy by the time we get into the evening. Something we're going to have to watch, again, I think from Jackson, Mississippi, all the way up to Birmingham, Montgomery, Alabama, points in between could be a very big hotspot for not only flooding, but also the severe weather into our Wednesday, and tornadoes could also be a factor as these storms continue to then weaken as we get into the overnight. By Thursday, just watching flooding becoming more of a risk over towards Atlanta and Georgia, up towards Greenville in South Carolina, and then Charlotte in North Carolina. And then, of course, we'll also have to watch any of the rain that we get up here to cause at least some isolated flooding as you get on up there into parts of the northern and eastern U.S. In terms of the total rainfall forecast here with the latest guidance from the Weather Prediction Center, you can see how flooding is also going to be a problem in addition to severe weather. By the time we get through Thursday afternoon and into the evening, we will have seen a lot of rainfall, especially out of northeast Texas in these yellows and oranges, with similar colors into parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, North Georgia, into the Carolinas, East Tennessee, and then up into Virginia. All these spots where you see the yellows and oranges, expecting anywhere from around 1 to 3 inches of rain, and some of those reds in that heavier stripe, again, where we see round after round of rain. Jackson, Mississippi, up into Birmingham, up towards Atlanta and Greenville. Lots of spots getting closer to 4 to 6 inches as we get towards that higher end, so be on the lookout for that flood threat to be an issue. I think this could become the bigger factor for a lot of folks with storms training over the same areas. With that being said, though, I want to briefly overview something that I'll be talking about plenty more in future updates. That's going to be that next winter storm. Once we get beyond this active pattern kicking off the early to the mid part of this week, we're not done, especially out west as we get to the end of this week. Out of Thursday into Friday, we're going to watch a lot of valley rain, especially along the coast there of Washington, Oregon, and then especially down into California. Crazy snow up into the Sierra Nevada range, and then snow and wind filling up a lot of the Mountain West as we go out of our Thursday night into the early part of our Friday, or even parts of Idaho, Utah, over into the Rockies. Really looking to see some snowfall pick up with some of these bands that could also bring that wind as we go out of Thursday into Friday. From there, eventually we see some of this energy transferring east, and again, I don't want to go into full all-out detail on this just yet, but it looks like we're going to see a northern snow threat, but possibly down here with all this rain, the most significant severe weather threat in terms of tornadoes and gusty winds that we've seen out of any recent winter storms here as we've gone through 2025 so far. So this is going to be a big concern down here on the south side of this storm. And if this system becomes potent enough and becomes a stronger low, we could also see some near blizzard-like conditions with whatever winter weather we see on up here into the northeast quadrant of the U.S. Something I'll be tracking. I'll be keeping you updated on the system as we get closer. But one last thing I wanted to show for you here is this temperature trends graphic I made about 5 days ago for this time frame, our February 11th, which is our Tuesday, heading into our Wednesday. Colder than average air was my projection based on model guidance for a lot of especially the northern and eastern U.S. as the cool air in the north combats that warm air in the south. That's what creates these contrast zones that create many winter storms in a line. The National Weather Service has actually issued extreme cold warnings for parts of the northern U.S. as a result of these forecasted low temperatures into our Wednesday, February 12th, and it will be very similar into our February 13th, which with a lot of zones up here into Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and then into the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, well below zero, even in some cases closer to -20 as you get on up there into the Canadian border, not even factoring in your wind during the morning time hours. And then even here, as you can see, by the time we get into our Wednesday afternoon, with that winter storm setup, with the low pressure taking a track just like this, a lot of spots even as far south here from Oklahoma to Missouri up to Illinois and Michigan, as well as the interior northeast, staying below freezing for forecast highs Wednesday. Back here on closer to that Canadian border, this is that extreme cold. People, pipes, and pets, especially on up here, being things that you need to consider in the north central U.S. as temperatures are expected to be below zero even for forecast highs on Wednesday. Meanwhile, down there towards the Gulf Coast, 70s and 80s, and we'll see another surge of that by the weekend with that next winter storm. That's all I have to say for this video, though. I really appreciate you sticking around for this longer edition. I'll catch you next time. Make sure you're subscribed.